After months of brutal fighting in the country's east, Ukraine is preparing for its much-anticipated counteroffensive against Russia.
Шановні воїни,
Dear warriors, the main battles are coming soon.
Since Ukraine's battle plans are confidential, little is definitively known about the coming counteroffensive. But military experts agree the stakes couldn't be higher.
Everyone's been expecting it, waiting for it. We don't know exactly when it's going to happen. We don't know exactly where it's going to happen.
They've got to look at this counteroffensive the way a pool shark looks at a pool table. He's not only trying to sink the ball, but he's also trying to set his cue ball up for a subsequent shot.
Here's the situation on the ground right now, and what to expect on the battlefield. Since the war began in February of 2022, Russia has focused its offensives almost exclusively on the east of Ukraine, in what's known as the Donbas region.
The offensive hasn't been particularly successful. They've lost thousands of troops. They've been using brutal tactics, shelling, destroying whole districts.
After heavy fighting, the city of Bakhmut is now under Russian control, Moscow's first major conquest since last summer. Russia now occupies 17% of Ukrainian territory, a stretch of landmass roughly equivalent to the size of Iceland.
But the Ukrainians are still there. So at the moment what we have is something like a violent stalemate.
So far, Ukraine's success and Russia's comparatively poor performance on the battlefield has surprised analysts.
The Russians expected Kiev to fall in a few days. They weren't expecting to fight a war. They were expecting to be marching in a victory parade.
Mark Kimmett is a retired U.S. Army Brigadier General who served in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Iraq.
Very early on, it was clear that the Russian forces, not only did they not have the tactics, their equipment proved incapable of doing that, and candidly, the Ukrainians surprised us all with both their tactical ability and their equipment as well.
we will never submit to any foreigners or colonizers. That's why we fight.
From the beginning of the war, Ukrainian President Zelensky made it clear that his aim is to liberate all Ukrainian territory, including Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine that were first occupied in 2014.
That seems an unlikely goal for the immediate offensive, because that's a big ask. That's a lot of Russian troops, who are well dug in.
We do not have that much artillery, but we do stay strong because we do have truth on our side.
Western weapons have been trickling into Ukraine since the start of the war. More recently, there's been a steady escalation of deliveries.
Its own Soviet stocks have been supplemented by large supplies of weapons from the West. And these have included long-range rocket artillery systems called HIMARS. More recently, you've had the West has provided battle tanks.
Hopefully they've got enough armored vehicles and enough tanks to make that punch necessary for a counteroffensive. But most important, they're going to need the intelligence from drones, perhaps from satellites, to get a good idea of the weakest point of the Russian front, because naturally that's where they want to attack.
Ahead of its counteroffensive, Ukraine has been carrying out drone attacks. The aim is to weaken the Russians ahead of the broader ground campaign. The current front line stretches 900 miles from the south of Ukraine all the way around the east up to the northeast. That's roughly the equivalent distance between New Orleans and Chicago.
So I don't think anybody at this point can predict the likely attack routes, but they certainly can predict a number of attack routes that they would use.
General Kimmett envisions 4 likely scenarios that the Ukrainian forces might attempt to kick off their counteroffensive.
Well, I think the first avenue of approach, I think the most obvious counterattack would be from Kherson over towards the Sea of Azov. It would have a significant tactical value because it would cut this land bridge that is so vital to the Russians between Crimea and to the rear of the Russian forces, not only for logistics purposes, but to demonstrate to the world that the Russians own all that area between Crimea and Luhansk. The second likely attack routes would be from Zaporizhia down to Berdyansk. It has very good roads that make a counteroffensive easier to operate with wheeled and tracked vehicles, which will be critical to this war. I think the third attack route would be through Donetsk down to Mariupol. It wouldn't have the tactical value as much of cutting that land bridge, because the land bridge would remain open between Crimea and a significant amount of the Russian forces. But the strategic communications value of retaking Mariupol, that city where the Ukrainians encountered probably their biggest defeat, I don't think you can overstate the value of retaking Mariupol and getting into the Russian minds that they have encountered a significant defeat. The last option I think that the Ukrainians would have would be attacking due east from Kharkiv to right in through Luhansk. That would have a significant strategic effect, because you now would be on the borders of Russia, and that would be sending a clear message to the Russian people that the Ukrainians are able to take back much of the land that they lost in 2014.
Despite the Ukrainians' impressive battlefield record thus far, Kimmett is cautious about making optimistic predictions.
I don't believe that the Ukrainians will be able to achieve a complete routing of the Russians such that they would withdraw from both Crimea and the Ukraine. And candidly, I don't think, unless there's an absolute collapse of the Russian forces, that will happen in the next year. My major milestone is, how deep do they get into Ukrainian territory? I'd like to see them get as far as the water. They've got to decisively defeat the Russians for this to be a successful counterattack, and it's got to be successful enough that it will continue to inspire the West to provide material and equipment for the next counterattack and the next counterattack after that, because this certainly will not end the war.
Ukrainian officials have also been quite keen to play down the sort of the larger aims of the offensive. They recognize that it's not the case that they'll suddenly be able to take back all of Ukrainian territory just from this offensive. They see this as one offensive, the next phase in the war. It's an important offensive, it's a critical offensive, but it's not the be-all and end-all.